Now, one of the great political catchphrases is it's the economy, stupid. So, will the economy influence or even decide the outcome of the race for the White House in November? Let's get the views of revered economic historian Brian Demetriou. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. How important will the economy be as a debating point going into November?
I think as a debating point, the economy is going to be very significant, probably the number one issue in the election. I mean, it is historically, and the economy is nowhere near as good as the American economy traditionally was for generation upon generation. I mean, labor force participation is way down. GDP is hovering around 2% instead of 3 or 4%. So the nation's restless economically. It'll be a big issue.
And the elephant in the room is America's national debt, which, Brian, I understand to be in the region of $35 trillion. That's hardly loose change. So neither candidate has much money to spend.
Well, the elephant in the room, I might say, is the American dream. I mean, that's what Americans care about economically. Historically, they always have. I mean, it's the land of opportunity. We can just do great things, start a business, get jobs, have a great, incredible experience economically across the entire lifespan. Countries that sponsor things like the American dream don't have debt problems. So if the United States has a $35 trillion debt problem and it looks insolvable, the problem is the underlying economy isn't growing enough. And I think the American people are so familiar with their tradition of mass prosperity, they understand that the main issue is economic growth and not the aggregate debt numbers.
Which of the two candidates looks more likely to grow the economy in the next 4 years, should they be elected, Brian?
Oh, I think without question it's Donald Trump. Donald Trump had a pretty surpassing economic policy when he came into office in 2017. And at that point, there was an 8-year expansion in the United States, and there was an increase in economic growth. I mean, that almost never happens at the tail end of very long expansions. There's an acceleration of economic growth towards 3%. That's a very powerful precedent. I don't think we've seen anything like that under Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris is running for president. I mean, we've seen kind of a collapse in a decrease in the labor force participation rate, no improvement on long-term GDP coming out of the pandemic. So I think Donald Trump's record is far superior.
And what is your appraisal of Joe Biden's economic record over the last 3.5 years? And Kamala Harris culpable in those outcomes, would you say?
I mean, if you look at the long-term GDP statistics, I mean, the United States is not recovering the old trends. I mean, it's barely recovering the post-2008 trend after the pandemic. And we should have GDP that's up a couple more points than it is right now, and that would start to make irrelevant the government debt. It's hard to say that the vice president is not responsible substantially for the economic policy under a presidency for the last 3 years. So, no, I expect if Kamala Harris becomes president, the markets and the global investing community will expect slower growth in the United States, and that would mean, of course, more fiscal problems domestically for the country.
Brian, do you anticipate that Kamala Harris, if she were elected president, would approach the economy differently to her predecessor, Joe Biden, or would it be essentially, a Joe Biden second term economically?
Well, I will say this, that the markets sometimes strongly appreciate when Democrats turn out to have a bark that's worse than their bite. I mean, Barack Obama came in kind of guns a-blazing, maybe even suggesting he was a socialist, and then it took a couple years to enact this kind of semi-national health care, and then extended the Bush tax cuts, which he had reviled so much on the campaign trail, and particularly in the top rate of the income tax. And when the markets realized, he's just kind of a paper tiger of the left, they went on a historic bull market in 2012. So I think Kamala Harris has that opportunity too, and she's starting to trim her sails in terms of kind of the left-wing policy. Hey, maybe we're not going to have a capital gains tax increase. And actually the markets could respond very positively to that. So if Kamala Harris trims her sails and says, look, I'm not really that much of a left-wing politician, the American economy might have some hope under that scenario.
Indeed, although that would be quite the political and ideological U-turn, wouldn't it, given that Kamala Harris historically has struck a very left-wing note, particularly in comparison to her boss, Joe Biden. And what about her offer of help to small businesses? Will that chime with the American public?
Well, the best thing that Donald Trump cut the corporate tax rate and kind of flattened it from 35 to 21%. If you want to help small businesses, I mean, the tax burden on small businesses is the easiest game to attack. So if there are government programs to help small businesses, that will addict small businesses to kind of federal welfare policy. And that's not really any kind of scenario to get small business going. But if small businesses' costs are declined through tax reform that flattens the tax code, that lessens labor taxes and capital taxes that really oppress small business, such as the Social Security tax, such as depreciation reform expenses, which aren't indexed for inflation. And we've just had a very, very serious inflation. So there's a real cost on businesses. And that would be the proper way to approach that problem.
Could Kamala Harris not argue that she and Joe Biden were in post during an unprecedented global pandemic?
Well, Donald Trump was the president during the great brunt of that pandemic in 2020 and the very beginning part of 2021. And then there was an enormous rush in terms of GDP recovery off the bottom that had already begun fully in 2020. So we should expect extremely robust economic growth statistics during the Biden presidency, and they're not as robust as they should have been because they didn't catch up to the previous precedent. So no, economic growth should have been higher than it turned out to be under Biden.
Is a future president, Brian, of the United States going to have to be straight with the American public and say, we are broke?
Well, the last time we dealt with a really kind of serious debt crisis was in the 1980s and early 1990s. I mean, Ronald Reagan had kind of stacked up, real big deficits, and so the debt had gotten very large. And Bill Clinton came in and kind of compromised with the Reagan tax cut rates, and then ended up cutting the capital gains rate cut, and all of a sudden the budget was in surplus. If the budget is balanced, just balanced, there's no hope for the national debt because it gets reduced every year by the retirement and interest payments. It gets reduced by nominal GDP. All you have to do is balance the budget. If we just reset to 2019 levels and adjust for inflation, it'd be very easy to balance the budget. So I think the next president should be straight that, we can completely solve this problem if we recommit to economic growth and reasonable levels of spending.
Of course, I'm sure, like me, Brian, you're looking forward to the TV presidential debates between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Not quite sure how that's going to pan out, what the optics of that will be, or who the stronger performer might be. Clearly, Kamala Harris, a formidable opponent, at least by comparison to Joe Biden. However, does Donald Trump have an Achilles heel when it comes to his economic policies? Is there a weak spot that Harris might exploit in those TV debates?
Well, yes, I think he does, in that the economy did not do well at all under the pandemic. Now, that was an unprecedented set of circumstances, yet it was the set of circumstances that the president, Donald Trump, had to deal with in 2020. And the economic kind of collapse was precipitous. And now, afterwards, one can wonder, was it appropriate to send out COVID checks as opposed to, say, eliminate the Social Security tax? Was it appropriate to kind of shut down the economy as opposed to alternatives? And yeah, I mean, there was a gigantic collapse in gross domestic product in 2020, and I think that's a fair question that Kamala Harris could put on the table in that debate.
Although, of course, the Democrats are owning those or co-owning those lockdowns. They're not going to be ideologically opposed to that experiment in communism that we saw during COVID, are they?
I'm never quite sure because, again, we have seen Kamala Harris trim her sails on, say, the capital gains tax increase. So she has it available to her to say, I might have been more open in the pandemic. And as I say, when kind of left-wing Democrats make major reversals in that direction, Barack Obama, again, extended the tax cut at the top of the George W. Bush tax cut to make sure it didn't expire in 2010, 2011, but not until after 2012. At the top, the very top right. So I think it's completely on the table for candidate Harris.
That's interesting. And Brian, does Kamala Harris pose a danger to the US economy? We don't really know what she'll do if she wins power. As you said, she's possibly going to be a more moderate figure than she has previously appeared to be. But going forward, it is the great unknown. We know what Donald Trump will do. He'll cut taxes and grow the economy as he did in 2016. But are you concerned by just what President Kamala Harris might do to the country?
Well, yes, I'm concerned about 44% capital gains rates, marginal tax rates over 50%, spending like crazy, especially on corporate welfare, the CHIPS Act. I mean, that's the Biden presidency, and she may do worse than that. Except I'll say at the same time, the great stock market crashes always happen under Republicans, 1987, 2001, 2008, and it's when Republicans fail to come through with kind of their classical supply side policy that the markets are really disappointed. But when Democrats prove themselves, well, maybe I was just a rhetorical left winger. Oh, does the economy breathe a sigh of relief? So again, she could be very dangerous, but then again, she could be very welcome. There is a Bill Clinton presidency tradition in the Democratic Party, just a spectacular economy in the 1990s. So if she does find that inner kind of Bill Clinton presidency, the economy could really like it.
Notwithstanding who wins in November, what does your knowledge of economic history tell us about the next 5 to 10 years of what we can expect from the biggest economy in the world?
The 21st century has been exceptional in American economic history. The GDP growth rate since the 2000 peak has been 2% per annum. That simply has never happened for any run of that duration in American history. It's always 3, 4, 5%, always 200 years through 1999, 2000. So this is kind of uncharted territory, the 21st century. Is that the new normal? Are we going to break out of that? I do think the Democrats are kind of making peace with that sub 2% growth, and I think the Republicans yearn for something better. And that will make all the difference. I mean, geostrategically and domestically and foreign, if the United States grows at 3, 4%, it's a very different world than if the United States grows for the long term at 1 or 2%.
Well, indeed, it would seem that, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, that you need solid economic growth, 3, 4, 5%, in order to stop America collapsing under the weight of its own debt. If you've got growth, you can swallow that debt, but if you don't, you can't, at which point the future becomes unimaginable. Brian, a deep privilege to have you on the show. I hope we're able to catch up soon. Renowned economic historian Brian Demetriou. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.